What if I told you that one of Europe's most mysterious ancient cultures, known more for their pottery than their people, held genetic secrets that would rewrite entire chapters of human history? Welcome to the story of the Bell Beaker people, a group once thought to be just a cultural phenomenon, but who have now emerged at the center of a major scientific discovery. For decades, archaeologists debated whether the spread of the Bell Beaker culture, famous for its distinctively shaped drinking vessels, was a movement of ideas or of actual people. Their artifacts were found scattered from the British Isles to Iberia, from Central Europe to North Africa. But who were the people behind these beakers? Were they local communities picking up new styles, or a migrating group shaping the genetic map of Europe? Thanks to the incredible advances in ancient DNA analysis, scientists have finally begun to answer that question. And the results? Shocking. The Bell Beaker culture was more than just a stylistic trend. It was a genetic force that transformed the continent. By decoding the genomes of over 400 individuals associated with the Beaker phenomenon, researchers have uncovered mass migrations, population replacements, and unexpected ties to the Eurasian steppe. In this video, we're diving into this fascinating genetic detective story. We'll uncover where the Bell Beaker people came from, how they spread so far, and why their DNA tells a much deeper tale than pottery ever could. Get ready for a journey through time, migration, and identity, one that will reshape how you think about ancient Europe forever. This isn't just archaeology. This is a revelation thousands of years in the making. Let's begin. The story of the Bell Beaker culture begins around 2800 BCE, during a time when Europe was a patchwork of local farming communities, each with their own customs and tools. Then, quite suddenly, a new style of pottery appears across vast stretches of the continent. These bell-shaped drinking vessels, often finely decorated and standardized in shape, begin showing up from the Iberian Peninsula in the west, all the way to Hungary and Poland in the east. But who were the people responsible for this dramatic cultural shift? Initially, scholars believed the Bell Beaker phenomenon was purely a cultural diffusion, a style of pottery and burial practice that local populations adopted without significant movement of people. In this view, the beaker-shaped pottery spread like fashion or technology, not through migration, but through contact and imitation. However, newer archaeological evidence suggested something more complex. Alongside the beaker pots were changes in burial styles, new metal tools, and shifts in settlement patterns, indicating a deeper transformation. The Bell Beaker people were not a monolithic group. Instead, they emerged independently in different regions, particularly in Iberia and Central Europe, before blending together into a larger, more cohesive cultural identity. This merging led to the rapid spread of the Bell Beaker package, which included distinctive pottery, copper weapons, archery-related items, and single burials under barrows, practices that distinguished them from earlier Neolithic traditions. Interestingly, the beaker culture coincided with the early stages of Europe's Bronze Age, marking a transition from stone to metal. This was not just a technological leap, but a shift in power and society. The Bell Beaker people were likely among the first in Europe to master copper metallurgy and long-distance trade networks. Their graves often contain archers' wrist guards, daggers, and amber beads, luxury goods that point to rising elites and expanding commerce. But what truly set the Beaker people apart was their mobility. They weren't just influencing neighboring regions, they were moving into them. In places like Britain, for example, the archaeological record shows a near-complete replacement of the earlier Neolithic population by people associated with the beaker culture. These weren't just new ideas arriving. They were new people carrying a new genetic legacy that would profoundly shape the future of Europe. So the rise of the Bell Beaker culture wasn't just about pots. It was about power, movement, and identity. It was the beginning of a new age, where societies became more connected, hierarchical, and dynamic. And as we'll see next, modern genetics would prove that this cultural wave carried something much deeper than artifacts. It carried the DNA of a migrating people whose impact still echoes in the genes of millions of Europeans today. For decades, the Bell Beaker people were an archaeological mystery. Historians and anthropologists debated whether the spread of their culture was due to trade and imitation or the result of actual population movements. But the mystery began to unravel with the help of a modern tool that's transforming our understanding of the ancient world: ancient DNA. In 2018, a groundbreaking genetic study involving over 400 ancient individuals from across Europe sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Published in the journal Nature, this massive project analyzed remains from multiple Beaker-associated sites and revealed something no one had fully anticipated. The Bell Beaker culture was not just a cultural phenomenon. It was a genetic one. Let's start with the British Isles. Prior to the arrival of Beaker people, Britain was home to a population descended from the original Neolithic farmers who had settled the land thousands of years earlier. But around 2400 BCE, something drastic happened. The genetic makeup of Britain completely shifted. Within a few hundred years, nearly 90% of the Neolithic gene pool was replaced by individuals carrying steppe ancestry, traced to the Amnea people of the Eurasian steppe, who had earlier migrated into Central Europe and mixed with local populations. This steppe-related DNA arrived with the Bell Beaker people. In essence, the Beaker expansion into Britain was not just the spread of a culture, it was a massive population replacement. The incoming Beaker groups brought not only new artifacts and customs, but also a new genetic signature that would dominate the region for millennia. What's even more fascinating is that this wasn't a uniform story across Europe. In Iberia, where the earliest Bell Beaker pottery originated, the genetic shift was far less dramatic. There, the local population adopted Beaker customs, but the genetic continuity remained largely intact. This shows that the Beaker culture could spread through both migration and cultural adoption, depending on the region. The Beaker genetic profile itself is a mix. These people carried a unique combination of Anatolian farmer, Western hunter-gatherer, and Yamnaya steppe ancestry. This triad created a new population identity, one that would become foundational for many modern European groups. Importantly, their Y chromosome lineage, known as our 1BM269, rapidly became dominant in Western Europe. Today, this lineage is still the most common among men in countries like France, Spain, and the UK. So why was this genetic revelation such a shock? Because it completely challenged earlier models that assumed continuity from the Neolithic. It revealed that massive population movements had reshaped the genetic landscape of Europe in ways we hadn't fully grasped before. The Beaker phenomenon wasn't just a cultural ripple. It was a demographic tidal wave. This DNA discovery didn't just rewrite Beaker history. It reshaped our entire understanding of Europe's deep past, revealing that the continent's current genetic makeup owes a tremendous debt to these once mysterious potters, archers, and metalworkers of the Bell Beaker world. If the Bell Beaker DNA revolution stunned scientists, it was because it tied into something even bigger: the story of the Amnea, one of the most influential ancient populations in human history. To understand the Bell Beaker people's genetic roots, we must journey back further to the Pontic Caspian steppe, where vast grasslands stretch between Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Around 3000 BCE, this region was home to the Amnea herders, and they would soon become the spark that ignited a transformation across the continent. The Amnea weren't city builders or monument carvers. They were pastoral nomads, skilled horse riders, and likely among the first to use wheeled vehicles. But what made them truly powerful was mobility, a lifestyle perfectly suited to the open steppe. They moved fast, traveled far, and in doing so, left a massive imprint on the gene pool of Europe. Genetic studies have shown that around 2500 BCE, populations with significant Yamnaya ancestry began appearing across Central and Western Europe. One of the most striking examples? The Bell Beaker people. As archaeogeneticists analyzed Beaker-era graves in Central Europe and Britain, they found a consistent genetic signal: steppe ancestry, pointing back to the Amnea. It was especially visible in male lineages, specifically the Y chromosome haplogroup R1BM269, which was almost non-existent in Neolithic Europe but became dominant after the Beaker expansion. This migration didn't just alter genetics, it may have changed language too. Linguists have long theorized about the origin of the Indo-European languages, the family that includes everything from English and Spanish to Hindi and Russian. One leading theory, known as the steppe hypothesis, proposes that Proto-Indo-European, the root language, originated with the Yamnaya and spread across Europe and Asia with their migrations. The Bell Beaker people, carrying Yamnaya DNA, are now seen as a likely vector for Indo-European language spread into Western Europe. While direct evidence of language is hard to trace in ancient DNA, the timelines and genetic connections make a compelling case. Where their genes went, new tongues followed, eventually evolving into Celtic, Italic, and Germanic languages. It's also worth noting the cultural fusion that occurred. The Bell Beaker people weren't Yamnaya clones, they were a hybrid. In Central Europe, Yamnaya-related groups, like the Corded, where culture blended with local Neolithic populations. The resulting mix gave rise to new cultural expressions, including the Bell Beaker tradition, which eventually spread west into Britain and south into Iberia. This genetic and cultural mosaic helped shape the future of Europe. The Yamnaya legacy, expressed through the Beaker people, became one of the foundational building blocks of modern European populations. Their impact wasn't just felt in genes and languages, but in social organization, metallurgy, and the very rhythm of ancient life. So, when we talk about the Bell Beaker people, we're not just talking about pottery and graves. We're talking about the echo of galloping horses across the steppe, about nomads whose descendants carried their fire and language across an entire continent. As the Bell Beaker people surged across Europe, they encountered societies that had already been living there for thousands of years, Neolithic Europeans. These early farmers had built massive stone monuments, cultivated crops, and raised livestock long before the Beaker culture appeared. The meeting of these two worlds wasn't just a passing encounter. It was a pivotal moment in prehistoric history marked by both clash and coexistence. In places like Britain and Iberia, archaeologists have uncovered dramatic shifts in the archaeological and genetic records. Before the arrival of the Beaker people, Britain was populated by descendants of Neolithic migrants from Anatolia, who had brought farming to Europe. These people were responsible for constructing Stonehenge and other megalithic monuments. Their DNA was distinct, rich in early European farmer ancestry, and low in steppe components. Then, around 2400 BCE, everything changed. The appearance of Bell Beaker pottery, metal tools, and burial customs marked the arrival of new people. But it wasn't just the culture that changed, it was the people themselves. Genetic studies, especially those focused on ancient skeletons in Britain, reveal that within just a few centuries of the Beakers' arrival, up to 90% of the local gene pool was replaced. It's one of the most dramatic population turnovers in European prehistory. What caused this replacement? The answer isn't straightforward conquest. There's little evidence of widespread warfare or destruction. Instead, the transformation seems to have come from migration, demographic dominance, and possibly disease. The Beaker people likely had certain advantages, like better access to metal tools, horses, or immunity to specific pathogens, that allowed their populations to grow rapidly. Over time, they absorbed, displaced, or outnumbered the existing Neolithic communities. But coexistence did happen. In Iberia, for example, the genetic picture is more mixed. There, Beaker-associated individuals show a blend of steppe ancestry and local farmer DNA. This suggests intermarriage and cultural exchange, where old and new traditions merged to form hybrid identities. Some of the earliest Iberian Beakers, interestingly, had no steppe ancestry at all, indicating that Beaker culture wasn't always linked to mass migration. It could also spread through networks of trade and imitation. What's fascinating is how the legacy of both groups survives in today's Europeans. The Neolithic farmers contributed genes related to eye color, height, and metabolism, while the steppe-descended Beaker people introduced other traits, including certain immune system adaptations. The blending of these populations laid the genetic and cultural foundation of Europe's future civilizations. Archaeological sites tell the rest of the story. Graves contain Beaker-style pots next to traditionally Neolithic artifacts. Settlements show architectural changes reflecting a fusion of ideas. In some places, the change was rapid and sweeping. In others, it unfolded gradually over generations. So, was it a conquest? A peaceful integration? The truth lies somewhere in between. The story of the Bell Beaker and Neolithic encounter is not one of simple domination. It's a tale of replacement, resilience, and recombination, as two worlds collided and created something entirely new. When we talk about the Bell Beaker people, it's easy to focus on pottery or burial customs. But behind those artifacts lies an extraordinary story of mobility. The beaker culture wasn't just about local shifts. It was a pan-European phenomenon, spreading across thousands of kilometers from Iberia to the British Isles, and from the Alps to the North Sea. This raises one of the most important questions in archaeology. How did they move so far, so fast? Recent genetic data has made it clear that the spread of beaker culture wasn't only the result of ideas catching on. It was driven in many cases by actual migration of people. Entire communities were on the move, carrying not just pots and tools, but genes, customs, and knowledge with them. These weren't simple, random wanderings. Instead, they appear to have been organized migrations, often following predictable geographic routes like river valleys, coastal paths, and mountain passes. And then there's the sea. The Bell Beaker people were remarkably maritime savvy. Along the Atlantic seaboard, they traveled in wooden boats, hopping from bay to bay, establishing connections between regions as distant as Portugal, Brittany, and southern Britain. Some archaeologists even argue that their ability to navigate rough coastal waters was a key factor in their success. They weren't just land-dwelling farmers. They were sailors, fishermen, and traders, using the sea as a highway long before modern ports or maps existed. This maritime capability gave rise to something equally important: trade networks. Beaker graves have turned up with items that traveled hundreds of miles from their source. Precious amber from the Baltic, copper from the Alps, tin from Cornwall, and shells from the Mediterranean all appear in beaker sites, showing how interconnected their world had become. They didn't just passively inherit earlier Neolithic trade routes, they amplified them, creating one of the most vibrant exchange systems in prehistoric Europe. One especially fascinating example is the movement of metals. The Bell Beaker people played a vital role in spreading early metallurgy across the continent. They helped transmit the knowledge of how to smelt copper and eventually how to make bronze, laying the groundwork for the Bronze Age. This wasn't just technological, it was transformational. Access to metal meant new tools, weapons, and symbols of power. And where metal flowed, influence followed. But this level of movement and connection wasn't just about goods, it also brought ideas. Cultural practices, religious beliefs, and social structures were exchanged along with artifacts. This might explain why the beaker phenomenon looked similar across Europe, yet had local flavors in different regions. Their trade networks acted like arteries pumping cultural innovation across the continent. In short, the Bell Beaker people weren't just potters or warriors. They were movers, connectors, and cultural brokers. Their ability to migrate, navigate, and trade helped shape the genetic and cultural map of Europe for generations to come. Long after the Bell Beaker people disappeared as a distinct culture, their legacy continued to echo across Europe in ways that are still unfolding today. While their pottery gave the culture its name, their deeper impact lies in something far more enduring: the transformation of European society, genetically, technologically, and culturally. One of the most striking legacies they left behind is in the burial practices that spread with them. The Beaker people introduced a standardized way of burying their dead, in individual graves, often accompanied by personal belongings like pots, arrowheads, and copper daggers. This was a dramatic shift from earlier communal burial traditions in Neolithic Europe. It suggested a growing emphasis on individual identity, social status, and personal heritage, which would go on to influence how later European societies thought about life, death, and ancestry. Another major contribution was their role in the spread of metallurgy. The Bell Beaker people weren't the first to use copper, but they were instrumental in expanding its use across Europe. They helped lay the foundation for the Bronze Age by not only spreading the knowledge of metalworking, but also integrating it into daily life, from tools to weapons to ornaments. The cultural shift toward metal defined entire epochs to come and reshaped how communities worked, fought, and interacted. The beaker culture also helped to shape the very demographics of Europe. As confirmed by ancient DNA, the expansion of the Bell Beaker people wasn't just cultural, but involved large-scale movements of people, especially from the Eurasian steppe. In places like Britain, the arrival of beaker-associated groups led to a near-total replacement of the existing Neolithic population within just a few hundred years. This wasn't just a cultural handoff, it was a genetic reset, and the effects are still detectable in modern European DNA. Language is another legacy possibly tied to the beaker world. While no one spoke Bell Beaker or wrote it down, many researchers now believe that these migrations may have helped pave the way for the spread of Indo-European languages across Western Europe. If this theory holds, it means that the Bell Beaker people didn't just bring pottery and copper. They helped plant the seeds of languages spoken today by hundreds of millions. Beyond science and genetics, there's a quieter legacy. The way archaeologists and historians have come to rethink cultural complexity in prehistory. For decades, the spread of artifacts like the beaker pot was seen as simple diffusion, people copying what they liked. But the Bell Beaker phenomenon forced a deeper look. It revealed how intertwined culture, migration, identity, and genetics really are. They taught us that prehistoric Europe was not static, but full of motion, exchange, and transformation. Today, the Bell Beaker people may not be a household name, but their impact, etched in graves, carried through genes, and whispered through ancient trade routes, still shapes the story of Europe. Their legacy is proof that even in prehistory, cultures could move, adapt, and leave behind echoes that resonate thousands of years later. For decades, the story of Europe's prehistoric past was written in stones, bones, and pottery shards. But the rise of ancient DNA research has flipped that script. Now, instead of only guessing who lived where and when based on artifacts, we can read their actual genetic code, opening a new and often surprising window into human history. And few cases illustrate this better than the Bell Beaker people. What DNA has shown us is that Europe's prehistory wasn't just a tale of slow cultural diffusion or isolated farming communities evolving in place. It was a story of migration, upheaval, and complete demographic transformation, and the Bell Beaker phenomenon stands at the heart of it. Through genome sequencing of ancient skeletons, researchers discovered that in many parts of Europe, especially in Britain, the arrival of the Bell Beaker people wasn't just a cultural import. It was a massive population replacement. In Britain alone, studies from 2018 revealed that over 90% of the genetic ancestry of the local population was replaced within just a few centuries after the Beaker migration. That means the descendants of Britain's original Neolithic farmers were largely absorbed or replaced by newcomers, people who carried steppe ancestry connected to the Amnea, and who brought with them a different lifestyle, new technologies, and possibly new languages. This was not just evolution, it was revolution. But perhaps more fascinating is how this genetic upheaval was not uniform. In places like Iberia, the spread of Bell Beaker culture seems to have been more cultural than genetic. Pottery and customs spread widely, but the people remained largely the same. This contrast forced scientists to move beyond simplistic explanations. Prehistoric Europe wasn't shaped by one grand pattern, but by a complex mosaic of local adaptations, migrations, and exchanges. One of the biggest revelations is that genes and culture don't always travel together. The beaker pots may be iconic, but they weren't always carried by genetically related people. Sometimes, neighboring communities adopted them without any major population movement. In other places, the pots came with entirely new people who would reshape the genetic landscape for good. Thanks to DNA, we've also learned more about how male lineages, particularly those carrying Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, swept across Western Europe alongside the Beaker expansion. This male-driven migration pattern is still evident today, with R1b being the most common Y DNA haplogroup in Western Europe. It's a silent reminder of a prehistoric shift with lasting consequences. In the end, what ancient DNA tells us about the Bell Beaker people is that Europe's past was far more dynamic than we once believed. These weren't static farming societies slowly learning new tricks. They were mobile, innovative, and capable of transforming entire regions. The Bell Beaker phenomenon, once thought to be just a style of pottery, is now recognized as one of the great turning points in European prehistory, thanks to the molecules locked in ancient bones. DNA didn't just add details to the story. It rewrote it. And as new skeletons are sequenced and new sites unearthed, the past will keep surprising us, one genome at a time.